Hello and welcome to the Ellen Made Book Club. This video is going to be all about African books. So the reason I'm doing this video is not because I'm some kind of expert, I'm definitely not, but I am trying to diversify my own reading, and I'm also hoping to encourage others to do the same, which is why I'm hosting the Diversity Book Bingo, which is a year-long reading challenge. And part of that reading challenge is to read books with different kinds of representation, and another part is to read books from different continents. And one of the continents that people seem to be struggling with the most is Africa. So I thought I would just do a video showing the books that I have read that are from African authors and set in Africa, some books that I have on my bookshelves to read, and some other books that are on my radar that I have on my audiobook app and can get from the library and things like that. And then at the end, I also want to include some ways that you can find even more books if none of these sound appealing to you. So let's start with some books that I have read and enjoyed. The first book I want to mention is My Sister the Serial Killer by Oyinkan Braithwaite. This is set in Nigeria and written by a Nigerian author. This is her first novel, and it was longlisted for the Booker Prize in 2019, I think it said. This is a thriller with some dark humor, and we follow a woman called Korede, and her sister Ayula is a serial killer, and Ayula has a tendency to kill her boyfriends. And so when Ayula becomes interested in a doctor at the hospital where Korede works, a doctor who Korede is also interested in, that creates some tension. If you have never read anything by an African author, I think this is a good place to start. It's a quick and fun read. It's fast-paced and funny, and it also has themes of sisterhood and family and some other things. I really enjoyed it, and that's the first book I will recommend. The next book I will mention I read several years ago, and this is The Yacubian Building by Ala Al-Aswani. This is set in Cairo in Egypt, and it follows the residents of a building, the Yacubian Building. I don't remember the plot well enough to describe it, but I remember enjoying it, and I remember just like the vibes of it and the atmosphere of it, and I remember thinking I would love to see this as a movie. I enjoyed the writing, and I thought it was funny, I think. I think there's also some queer representation in here, and it's just a very interesting novel, and I would love for more people to read this so we can discuss it. I would also like to reread this at some point. So that's my second recommendation. The next one is a memoir that I read earlier this year, which is Unbowed by Wangari Maathai. I tend to say Maathai, but I think it's pronounced Maathai. She was the first African woman to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, which is quite an accomplishment. She founded the Green Belt movement in Kenya, where they were planting lots of trees, and particularly women were planting lots of trees. And in this memoir, she tells her life story, starting with her childhood, and also giving some context of colonialism and independence and the effects that all of that had on the landscape in Kenya and how, the Green Belt movement came to be. She was also a political activist in other senses. I found this memoir to be very easy to read. The writing style is very accessible and personable. I found it to be inspiring and hopeful. And I think that if you are at all interested in environmental issues, or just, like to read stories about people who start small and then accomplish a lot, I think Unbowed is a great one to read. The next book is not necessarily very hopeful, but it is very informative, and that is Homegoing by Ya Gyasi. She was born in Ghana and raised in the United States, and this story takes place in both of those countries. The story starts with two half-sisters in Ghana who are not aware of each other, and one of them is sold as a slave, and the other is married to a slave trader. So one of them stays in Ghana, and we follow her lineage through the generations, and we also follow the woman who is sold as a slave and her lineage in the United States. And so this story takes place over decades, and it shows a lot of history and the developments throughout those decades and the challenges that people of African descent has had to face in both countries. This is a tough read in many ways, but I also think that it's very much worth it. I think it shows American history and like the evolution over the decades in a very clear way, but it also gives it a personal touch and like connects it to personal experiences throughout all of the different changes. And so we're not at this like high level where we don't really see the people. We're in the experience of one person at a time. And I just think that's a very good way to give voice to the people who experienced that. Yeah, highly recommend this one. Next up, I have Oil on Water by Helon Habila. This is a sort of literary thriller. I didn't find it very thrilling, or I didn't think that it read like a thriller, but it does have elements of a thriller. So I think if you go into this expecting literary fiction with some suspense, you might really enjoy this one. In this story, we follow a young journalist called Rufus. He is tasked with finding the kidnapped wife of a British oil engineer. So he journeys into the Niger Delta and he comes across different militant groups. And so he's trying to survive that ordeal and also find out what happened to this woman. This isn't a personal favorite for me, but I do think that it's, high quality, and I think that it is a book that someone else might enjoy a lot. It's also not very long. It gives some insight into environmental, political issues in Nigeria, while also being a suspenseful story that is atmospheric and well written. The next book is not by an African author, so it's not African literature, but I wanted to mention it anyway for the sake of the diversity book bingo, and in case you're someone who isn't familiar with African literature at all and you want to like just dip your toe in, I wanted to recommend The Maid and the Crocodile by Jordan Efueko. This is a sort of add-on to the Raybearer duology, which I haven't read. It's a young adult fantasy set in a fantasy world that is inspired by and sort of reminiscent of Africa, and I think West Africa. This author is American, but I think her parents are from an African country or maybe two African countries. A bit of a stretch, but I think this could count if you are a fantasy reader and want to dip your toes into, this kind of vibe. I also know that there are plenty of other African fantasy writers. I just haven't read any of them. So I just wanted to mention this as an option, and I will leave some other fantasy authors from African countries in the description. The last book that I have read is Crooked Seeds by Karen Jennings. This is a literary fiction and a sort of speculative fiction. It's set in South Africa, like a couple of years in the future, I think. It's very bleak and very miserable and dealing with some really horrible things. We follow a woman who has an amputated leg, and she is very poor and she is struggling, and pretty much everybody is struggling. There is a water shortage, there's been a drought, so there's some like environmental commentary in the story as well. And then there's also a lot about this woman's family history and her mother and her brother and the house that they lost. And it's a very interesting read, but I will also say that it is a very bleak one. And I think that you kind of need to be in a good headspace to read that book. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say about that one. Let's move on to the books that I have on my TBR, starting with one that I have from the library, which is These Letters End in Tears by Musi Teji Xavier, I think is how you say the name. I looked it up, and so hopefully I got it right, but sorry if I mispronounced that. This is a story about two women in Cameroon, and they have some kind of a relationship when they are younger, and then they sort of go their separate ways, and then there's some kind of a reconnection going on, I think. I think one of the women sort of finds the other Yeah, a chance encounter with people from her past pushes her to finally go after the truth of her lover's whereabouts, told mostly through unsent letters. So this is about the criminalization of homosexuality in Cameroon and the enduring love and the relationship of these two women. I am a bit hesitant to pick this one up because I think it's going to be an emotional read, which, you know, kind of have to be in the mood for something like this. But I've heard good things, and yeah, I'm looking forward to reading this one. The next book I've had on my shelves for quite a while now, and I'm still interested in reading it. I think this is also going to be an emotional one or sort of a heavy one, but I do think it's going to be really good, and that is River Spirit by Leila Abulela. This is an author from Sudan, and this story takes place in Sudan in the 1880s. We follow a girl called Akuani. She and her brother are orphaned in a village raid, taken in by a young merchant whose vow to care for them will tether him to Akuani throughout their lives. As revolution brews, Sudan begins to prize itself from its Ottoman rulers, and everyone must choose sides. A powerful tale of unshakable devotion to a cause, to faith, and to the people who become family. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this one, and I also think it's going to be a challenging read in some ways. Next, I have Little Rot by Akweki Emezi, who is a Nigerian author. One weekend, the elite underbelly of a Nigerian city, a tangled web of sex and lies and corruption that leaves no one unscathed. It's said to be a roller coaster of a novel. It's steamy, thrilling, twisty, poetic. It sounds like a fun time, and I've heard lots of good things about this author, who I think has also written some fantasy novels, I think in adult fantasy and young adult fantasy, as well as some other books in other genres. I keep hearing really good things about them, and I really want to try their work, and this is the one that I ended up getting. There's a longtime couple who have just split and visit an exclusive sex party. There is Ola and Soraya, two Nigerian sex workers who are coming to a scene, and just as everything goes to hell, there seems to be a lot going on in this novel, and I'm really intrigued to try it. If you are more of a mystery thriller reader, this one might be of interest to you. It's Light Seekers by Femi Kayude, and I think there's also a sequel to this called Gaslight, which I don't have, but I figured I would read the first book first. This one follows an investigative psychologist. There are 3 students who are brutally murdered in a Nigerian university town. Their killings are caught on social media, so the world knows who murdered the students, but no one knows why. I'm really intrigued to read this, and I think that like going the route of thrillers or like genre fiction is a good way to approach literature from any continent, because it's sort of more familiar and it's less like heavy, even though this is a heavy topic, but like any thriller is dealing with dark things. But this is still a format that is familiar, and there's, you know, suspense and a thrilling plot, and not just like classics or literary fiction, which can feel a bit more daunting perhaps. A thriller is just a thriller, and this is just a thriller in Nigeria by a Nigerian author. I think that's a good way to approach African literature. Speaking of classics and books that are a little bit more intimidating, my next one is Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. This is a modern classic that was first published 1958, I think, and was sort of the first novel from an African perspective as opposed to a European colonialist perspective. This is set in Nigeria as well, toward the end of the 1800s. I wouldn't say I'm like excited to read this or super intrigued. I more so want to have read it, but I figured it's worth mentioning if you're a person who wants to like start with the classics and like start with the foundational works. This one is one of those. It also says in the foreword that this is like mandatory reading in African high schools. So yeah, I think this is one that should be read at some point, but yeah, I think it's also going to be a challenging one as well. My next book is Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo, and I'm not sure this is a book that is going to be for me, but I have heard really good things and I found it secondhand, so I figured I would pick it up, and maybe this will be something that you are interested in. This is about a couple who want to have children, or at least the woman does. It's a love story, there's political turmoil, and it's also about sort of old tradition versus new society and new values. Yeah, I've heard really good things. This would be a good one to try if you like those kinds of stories. And then a book that I got more recently is The Impatient by Shaili Amadou Amal. This is set in Cameroon and also deals with relationships, but this one is about, I think there are 3 women who are married to the same man, and there's also, let me see, no, that's not it. It is about 3 women and their marriages, and there is polygamy in here, but they're not all married to the same man. I'll just read what it says on the back. Munyal, patience, is the only consolation given to heartbroken Ramla on her wedding day. It is the Fulani reply to any wife's grievance, and ahead of her arranged marriage, the only piece of advice prescribed. After the luminous Ramla comes her quiet sister, Hindu, forced to marry their delinquent cousin. And finally, Safira, Ramla's new co-wife, who resentfully accepts sharing her husband of 20 years. From an early age, these 3 were raised to submit to men or risk repudiation. The Impatient is a rallying cry for change about 3 women who defy the oppressive traditions that dominate their lives. It's inspired by the author's own experiences. This is translated from the French by Emma Ramadan, and it's a short book. It's only about 150 pages, so this could also be a good place to start. And then the final one that I have a physical copy of is A Woman at Point Zero by Nawal El Sadawi, an Egyptian writer, novelist, and fighter for women's rights, which sounded really good to me. This is translated from the Arabic by Sherif Hetata, and I'll just read from the back. Firdaus is on death row. Her crime, the murder of a man. Born into poverty in a rural Egyptian village, her childhood dreams and ambitions had been met with neglect and abuse by the world and the men who rule it. Driven to sex work to support herself, she is faced with the moral outrage of society and the bitter knowledge that for a woman, true freedom comes only when all hope is abandoned. This was published in 1973. It's also a really short one. It's about 130 pages. I was intrigued by the crime thing and the women's rights thing, and it being written by a female Egyptian writer. I've heard good things and I'm really excited to get to this one. I don't think it's going to be an easy read by any means, but yeah, I'm really intrigued. Next, I wanted to mention some books that I have on my audiobook app. The first one is The Talk of the Party by Foluso Agbaye, who is the author of The Parlor Wife, which I haven't read, but I have heard good things. The Talk of the Party is a mystery thriller, psychological thriller set in Nigeria and centers a 60th birthday party. This party is the hottest ticket in town, but champagne isn't all that's being served. The Obanile's picture-perfect life is the envy of all Lagos society, and everyone wants a piece. So when renowned matriarch Bukola's birthday approaches, there are no expenses spared. 500 guests are invited, and her 4 children are all in attendance. Everything will be perfect just as planned, except living the dream comes at a price, and as the party draws closer, each of the Obanile children find themselves embroiled in scandals that could shatter the flawless reputation their mother has carefully built. It says it's a highly entertaining family drama. It sounds like it's got lots of secrets and twists and turns, and so that sounds like a good summer thriller to pick up. Another one that I have saved is The Ones We Loved by Tarisai Ngangura. I think this is contemporary general fiction. It says it's a love story of 2 young people who must surrender to heartache before claiming the peace they seek, from a debut author of unusual power and grace. On a bus moving across a rural landscape from town to dusty town, 2 young people are escaping with their lives. She has committed a crime for which there will be retribution. He is staggering from a devastating discovery. These 2 will find each other and attempt a new way forward, with nothing to hold on to except hope. Told in the rhythms of oral retellings practiced by Zimbabwe's Shona ethnic group, where the soundscapes of a Ngano story. Its melodies, pauses, lifts, and stops creates a call and response with the audience. This came out last year, and I think it sounds really interesting. I'm really curious about this call and response way of telling a story. And it's set in Zimbabwe, and I've never read anything set there. And so, yeah, I'm just very intrigued. And if you need a book set in Zimbabwe, maybe try this one. Next, I have a book that I have saved, but I don't really know a lot about. It's called The Eternal Audience of One by Remy Ngamije. Sorry if I'm saying that very wrong. It seems to be contemporary fiction as well. And it says, meet the future of African literature with this gorgeous, wildly funny, and above all, profoundly moving and humane coming-of-age tale following a young man who is forced to flee his homeland of Rwanda and make sense of his reality. We follow Seraphine, who is from Rwanda, living in Namibia and about to leave for Cape Town, where loyal friends, hormone-saturated parties, adventurous conquests, and race controversies await. More than that, his long-awaited final year in law school promises to deliver a crucial puzzle piece of the Great Plan Immigrant, a degree from a prestigious university. I think this one sounds really interesting. It seems to encompass history and racial tension in different African countries, and is also somehow funny. Yeah, I think this one sounds really good. I'll do a little bit of a rapid fire round with some more titles that are on my radar. The first one is A Bigger Picture, My Fight to Bring a New African Voice to the Climate Crisis by Vanessa Nakate. This came out in 2021, and yeah, it's a nonfiction about the climate crisis from, one African perspective. I think she is from Uganda. A Mouthful of Salt by Reem Ghaffar is a historical literary fiction set in Sudan. It says, the Nile brought them life, but the Nile was not their friend. When a little boy drowns in the treacherous currents of the Nile, the search for his body unearths calamity and disaster and exposes forgotten secrets buried for generations in a small northern Sudanese village. 3 women try to make their way through a world that wants to keep them back, separated from each other by time, but bound together by the same river that weaves its way through their lives, giving little but taking much more. That sounds good. The Lion's Den by Iris Mansa is set in Zambia and is tagged as queer historical fiction thriller. A missing boy, a corrupt system, a case that could change everything. And then the final one that I will mention is Theft by Abdul Razak Gurna, which is set in Tanzania in East Africa. This author won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2021. And it says it's a captivating story of the intertwined lives of 3 young people coming of age in post-colonial East Africa in the 1990s. Hopefully at least one of these books has piqued your interest, and if nothing else, maybe you have just gotten a peek into the variety of books that are available from African authors. I will also mention a couple of tips on how to find more books if none of these are it for you. The first one is to Google and search for, books by African authors. You could also, narrow it down to specific countries and, find lists of authors that way. I know there are lots of lists on Goodreads, for instance. I will link a couple of them below, and I think those are easiest to find by searching on Google. Like the Goodreads search is not very good. I also think that Storygraph challenges are a great way to find books. If you look on the Diversity Book Bingo Storygraph challenge, there is a prompt for the continent of Africa, and so all of the books that are saved there should be by African authors and set in an African country. You might need to double check because, again, it's like personal preference and how strict you want to be, and so people might have added things that are, stretching it a little bit. But there are also a lot of other reading challenges. I will leave links to a couple of them as well. There are reading challenges for, just Africa as a continent, where each prompt is a different country. There are also like read around the world challenges. There's also a read around the world by female authors. So if you're looking for particularly female authors from Africa, that's one way to do it as well. My final tip is to search for YouTube videos, and again, like, narrow it down. You can always search for African literature or like African book recs. Maybe that's how you found this video, but you can also like narrow it down a little bit. Maybe you're looking for, African fantasy books or African science fiction books. Maybe you're looking for African queer literature. There are lots of different things that you can put together and find new videos on those topics. And again, you can also add specific countries. I will leave links to a couple of videos that I have found that looked interesting or that I have watched and enjoyed, and you can check them out and see if maybe you can find some recommendations on there. Hopefully this video has been helpful in some way or inspiring in some way, and hopefully you will find good African books to read. Feel free to share your own recommendations in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.